China just lost $12 billion and access to the world's largest oil reserves in a single political collapse. Venezuela, the country China spent 15 years and tens of billions of dollars propping up, is now falling into America's sphere of influence. And China can't do anything about it. For over a decade, China lent Venezuela more than $60 billion, making it China's largest debtor in Latin America. In exchange, Venezuela promised oil, lots of it. Venezuela has 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the largest in the world, even more than Saudi Arabia. China was supposed to get preferential access to that oil for decades through oil for loan agreements. But on January 10, 2026, Venezuela's contested government collapsed further into crisis. Nicolás Maduro, China's ally, is losing legitimacy internationally. The US-backed opposition is gaining ground, and suddenly, all those Chinese loans, all that promised oil, all that strategic influence in America's backyard, it's evaporating. China is staring at $10 to $12 billion in unrecoverable debt, lost oil contracts worth billions more annually, and the humiliation of watching America reclaim influence in a country China thought it had secured. This isn't just a financial loss. It's a geopolitical defeat that exposes the fatal flaw in China's strategy, betting on authoritarian regimes that can collapse overnight. In this video, I'm exposing exactly how China invested $60+ billion in Venezuela over 15 years, why Venezuela's political collapse means China loses everything, what happens to the $12 billion in debt China is owed, how America is reclaiming control of Venezuela's oil, and what this disaster teaches about China's Belt and Road vulnerabilities worldwide. But before we expose China's $12 billion Venezuelan disaster and what it reveals about their global strategy, if you want to understand how geopolitical shifts affect investments and which countries are next to default, subscribe to the Investor's Lens. Hit subscribe now. But there's one number in China's Venezuela relationship that reveals just how catastrophically wrong this bet went, and it's bigger than most people realize. It's $60 billion. That's how much China lent Venezuela between 2007 and 2020, and most of it will never be repaid. Let me walk you through how China got here. In 2007, Hugo Chávez was Venezuela's president and an open enemy of the United States. He nationalized oil companies, kicked out American firms, and needed money desperately because his socialist policies were destroying Venezuela's economy. China saw an opportunity. While America isolated Venezuela through sanctions, China offered cash, lots of it. From 2007 to 2016, China lent Venezuela approximately $62 billion through development banks and oil companies. This made Venezuela China's single largest debtor in Latin America and one of the largest Chinese lending recipients globally. The deal structure was simple but risky. China would lend billions of dollars, and Venezuela would repay with oil shipments. It's called an oil-backed loan. Venezuela didn't send cash. They sent crude oil directly to China at discounted prices. China locked in cheap oil for decades while gaining strategic influence in America's backyard. At the time, it seemed brilliant. Venezuela had 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the world's largest. Even if they only extracted a fraction, that's enough oil to repay China many times over. And politically, China gained a loyal anti-American ally in South America, right in the U.S. sphere of influence. But then everything collapsed. Hugo Chavez died in 2013. Nicolás Maduro took over and proved even more incompetent. Venezuela's oil production, which was 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998, collapsed to under 500,000 barrels per day by 2020. The economy shrank 75% in less than a decade. Hyperinflation hit 1,000,000% in 2018. 6 million Venezuelans fled the country. And the oil shipments to China? They slowed to a trickle. Venezuela couldn't produce enough oil to export because the state oil company, PDVSA, was bankrupted by corruption, sanctions, and mismanagement. Infrastructure crumbled. Refineries stopped working. Wells went offline. By 2020, Venezuela owed China approximately $19 billion in unpaid loans. By 2023, estimates put outstanding debt at $10 to $12 billion after some repayments in oil. But here's the problem. Venezuela still can't pay. Oil production remains under 1 million barrels per day. The country is effectively bankrupt. China tried to protect its investment. They sent oil engineers to help restart production. They sent diplomats to negotiate with the Maduro government. They provided additional smaller loans to keep PDVSA functioning. But nothing worked. You can't fix a fundamentally broken, corrupt system by throwing more money at it. And now, with Maduro's government losing legitimacy and potentially being replaced by a U.S.-backed opposition, China faces the worst outcome possible. A new Venezuelan government might simply refuse to honor the debt. After all, those loans were made to Maduro's regime, not to the Venezuelan people. A new government could declare them illegitimate and void the contracts. So China invested $60 billion, got back maybe $50 billion in oil at best, and is staring at $10 to $12 billion in defaults with no recourse. That's not just a bad investment. That's a geopolitical catastrophe. But the money is only half the loss. This next loss is perhaps the most devastating because it's not just about money. It's about long-term strategic resources that China desperately needs. It's access to 303 billion barrels of oil. And China just lost it to America. Let me explain what Venezuela's oil meant to China's energy security. China is the world's largest oil importer, consuming about 15 million barrels per day. Despite being a major economy, China produces only about 5 million barrels domestically. That means they must import 10 million barrels per day, roughly 70% of their total consumption. This creates strategic vulnerability. China relies on Middle Eastern oil shipped through the Strait of Hormuz and Malacca Strait, choke points the U.S. Navy controls. If U.S.-China relations deteriorate further, Taiwan conflict, trade war escalation, America could theoretically block these shipping lanes, choking off China's oil supply. Venezuela was supposed to solve this problem. Located in South America, Venezuelan oil doesn't pass through U.S.-controlled Asian choke points. It's in the Western Hemisphere, but far from direct U.S. military bases. And with 303 billion barrels of reserves, larger than Saudi Arabia's 267 billion, Venezuela represented a generation of energy security for China. The oil for loan deals gave China preferential access. PDVSA agreed to send a significant portion of Venezuelan oil production directly to China at discounted prices for decades. At peak, Venezuela was sending 500,000 to 600,000 barrels per day to China, about 4 to 6% of China's total imports. But more important than current flows was future potential. China's strategy was long-term. Keep Maduro in power, help rebuild Venezuela's oil industry, and eventually ramp production back to 2 to 3 million barrels per day. If successful, Venezuela could supply 15 to 20% of China's oil needs, reducing dependence on the Middle East significantly. That strategy is now dead. Here's why. First, Venezuela's oil production keeps falling. Instead of recovering to 2 to 3 million barrels per day, production remains stuck under 1 million. The infrastructure is so damaged that recovery would take $200 to $300 billion in investment over 10 to 15 years. China isn't willing to throw that much more money into a collapsing country. Second, U.S. sanctions make Venezuelan oil toxic. American sanctions prohibit most companies from buying Venezuelan oil or providing services to PDVSA. China can technically still buy, they're not bound by U.S. law, but it complicates shipping, insurance, financing, and refining. Most international companies won't touch Venezuelan oil for fear of U.S. secondary sanctions. Third, most critical political change is coming. If Maduro falls and a U.S.-backed government takes power, they will almost certainly renegotiate or cancel Chinese oil contracts. The new government will want to restore relations with Washington, attract American investment, and distance themselves from the Maduro regime's deals. The U.S. has already made clear they'll support Venezuela's opposition. In January 2025, the U.S. recognized opposition leader Maria Corina Machado and her coalition as legitimate representatives. They've offered sanctions relief if Maduro steps down and fair elections occur. They're essentially bribing the Venezuelan opposition and military to abandon Maduro, and it's working. Maduro's support is collapsing. The military is fracturing. The economy is in ruins. It's only a matter of time before the regime falls, either through elections, coup, or popular uprising. When that happens, China loses everything. A new pro-U.S. Venezuelan government will redirect oil exports to American refineries, cancel Chinese contracts, and possibly even demand China forgive the $10 to $12 billion in debt as a condition of reopening relations. China bet big on controlling Venezuela's oil. America is about to win it back. That's a generational resource loss for Beijing, but it gets worse. The debt itself is worthless. Here's the financial reality China is facing: $10 to $12 billion in Venezuelan debt that will almost certainly never be repaid in full, and China has zero recourse. It's sovereign debt default. And when authoritarian regimes collapse, their debts disappear with them. Let me explain why this debt is effectively worthless. When China lent Venezuela $60 billion, the loans were structured as government-to-government agreements between Chinese state banks, China Development Bank, Export-Import Bank of China, and the Venezuelan government or PDVSA state oil company. These weren't normal commercial loans with collateral and legal protections. They were political loans, designed to build influence, not maximize financial returns. The collateral was Venezuelan oil shipments, but there was no mechanism to actually seize Venezuelan oil fields if they defaulted. So when Venezuela stops paying, what can China do? Practically nothing. They can't sue in Venezuelan courts, controlled by Maduro, who won't rule against himself. They can't sue in Chinese courts. Pointless, no way to enforce judgment in Venezuela. They can't sue in U.S. courts. U.S. won't help China collect debt from a country America is trying to influence. They can't seize Venezuelan assets abroad. Most are already frozen by U.S. sanctions. China's only leverage was keeping Maduro in power, so he'd keep paying. But now even that's failing. Maduro's government is so weak that even with Chinese support, it's collapsing. And here's the worst part: when a new government takes power in Venezuela, they will almost certainly repudiate Maduro's Chinese debt. This is standard practice when authoritarian regimes fall. The new government declares the old regime's debts were illegitimate, contracted through corruption, and not in the interest of the Venezuelan people. Historical precedent supports this. When Iraq's Saddam Hussein fell in 2003, the new government successfully got $120 billion in Saddam-era debt forgiven or restructured. When Ukraine's pro-Russian government fell in 2014, Ukraine disputed debts to Russia. When Cuba transitioned away from Castro-era policies, they renegotiated or repudiated billions in Soviet-era loans. A post-Maduro Venezuelan government will make the same argument. These Chinese loans didn't benefit the Venezuelan people. They propped up a dictator while our people starved, We won't honor them. And China will have no response. They can't invade Venezuela to collect, too far away, no military capability to project power there. They can't sanction Venezuela economically. Venezuela has nothing China needs that they can't get elsewhere now. They can't even complain too loudly diplomatically. It would expose their failed strategy. The $10 to $12 billion is simply gone. It's a write-off. Chinese state banks will eventually have to recognize these loans as non-performing and take massive losses on their balance sheets. For context, $12 billion is more than China's entire annual foreign aid budget to Africa, equivalent to 100-plus Belt and Road infrastructure projects, larger than most developing countries' entire external debt, a loss that provides zero return to Chinese taxpayers. And the worst part? China can't even learn from this and change course, because they've already made similar bets in dozens of other countries through Belt and Road. Venezuela is just the first major default. It won't be the last. The debt is worthless. The oil access is lost, and the geopolitical humiliation is just beginning. Meanwhile, America is moving in to take everything. Here's how the United States is systematically reclaiming control of Venezuela while China watches helplessly from the sidelines. Move 1. Diplomatic recognition strategy. The U.S. recognized Maria Corina Machado and the opposition as Venezuela's legitimate representatives in January 2025. This gives them legal standing to negotiate on behalf of Venezuela internationally. It isolates Maduro diplomatically and signals to the Venezuelan military and elite that America will support a transition government. Move 2. Sanctions relief carrot. The U.S. has offered to lift all sanctions on Venezuela if Maduro steps down and allows free elections. Venezuelan sanctions cost the economy $100+ billion since 2015. The promise of sanctions relief is a massive incentive for anyone who wants to rebuild Venezuela's economy, and it makes clear that only a U.S.-friendly government will get access to international markets. Move 3. Military and elite pressure. The U.S. is working behind the scenes with Venezuelan military leaders, offering amnesty and financial support if they abandon Maduro. Intelligence reports suggest multiple generals have already made contact with U.S. officials. The Venezuelan elite see that the Chinese gravy train is ending and are looking for new patrons. Move 4. Oil company positioning. American oil companies Chevron, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips are already positioning to return to Venezuela the moment a new government takes power. Chevron received a U.S. sanctions waiver in 2022 to operate limited operations in Venezuela, establishing a foothold. Once sanctions lift, American companies will flood back in with capital and technology to restart production. Move 5. IMF and World Bank leverage. Venezuela owes the IMF and World Bank billions and has been shut out of international financing for years. The U.S. controls these institutions. Once a new government takes power, the U.S. will structure bailout packages that require canceling Chinese contracts and prioritizing American investment. The strategy is comprehensive and effective. America is offering Venezuela everything China couldn't: sanctions relief, international legitimacy, access to capital markets, technology to restart oil production, and integration into the global economy. And because America controls the international financial system, dollar, SWIFT, IMF, World Bank, bond markets, they have leverage China simply doesn't have. Venezuela's future government, whether it comes through elections, coup, or transition, will almost certainly be pro-American, not pro-Chinese. They'll need U.S. support to survive politically and economically. That means canceling Chinese contracts, redirecting oil exports to U.S. refineries, and accepting American investment. China invested 15 years and $60 billion to gain influence in Venezuela. America is taking it back in 18 months with diplomacy, sanctions policy, and financial leverage. That's a complete strategic defeat for Beijing. So, what does this disaster reveal about China's global strategy? Here's the terrifying truth for China. Venezuela isn't unique. It's a warning sign of what could happen across dozens of Belt and Road countries. China has lent over $1 trillion to developing countries since 2000 through Belt and Road and related initiatives. Many of these countries are politically unstable, authoritarian regimes, economically weak, can't repay without resource exports, strategically located ports, minerals, energy, potentially vulnerable to U.S. influence. Sound familiar? That's the exact profile as Venezuela. Countries at high risk of going Venezuela: Pakistan owes China $60+ billion, politically unstable, requires IMF bailouts. Sri Lanka, already defaulted on Chinese loans, facing IMF restructuring. Zambia, defaulted on $3+ billion, requesting debt forgiveness. Ecuador, $4.6 billion owed. Elected anti-China president. Ethiopia, civil war. $13.5 billion owed. U.S. involved in peace talks. Each of these could follow Venezuela's pattern: political change to debt repudiation to reorientation toward the West. China's strategy of buying influence through loans to unstable regimes has a fatal flaw. Authoritarian governments collapse and their debts disappear with them. Investment implication: avoid Chinese infrastructure/development banks. They'll take massive losses. Avoid Chinese companies with heavy Belt and Road exposure. The Venezuela disaster is the first domino. More will follow. China's $60 billion Venezuelan loss isn't just a one-time mistake. It's a systematic vulnerability in their entire global strategy. So we've exposed China's catastrophic Venezuelan defeat, how they invested $60+ billion over 15 years to gain influence, and access to 303 billion barrels of oil reserves, only to watch it all collapse. The $10 to $12 billion in unrecoverable debt that will likely be repudiated by any post-Maduro government. The loss of strategic access to the world's largest oil reserves just when China needs energy security most. How America is systematically reclaiming control through diplomatic recognition, sanctions relief, and support for the opposition, offering everything China couldn't provide. And the terrifying reality that Venezuela is the warning signal for dozens of Belt and Road countries, where China has lent over $1 trillion to politically unstable regimes. This is what happens when you bet on authoritarian governments instead of building genuine economic relationships. But here's something I didn't tell you at the start of this video. Everything I just shared is completely useless if you don't know which other Belt and Road countries are next to default, which Chinese banks have the most exposure to, developing country debt, and how to short Chinese infrastructure investments before the losses become public. Without this tactical knowledge, you'll miss the opportunities to profit from China's systematic strategic failures. Comment under this video, and I will reveal the 5 Belt and Road countries most likely to default next, and exactly how to position for China's developing world debt crisis. I'll see you in the next one.